Yes, thank you everyone. And I guess it's my job to also help make up time. So I'll be as quick as I can and try to give you the insight to one of the EU funded projects within the Caribbean that was very well received within the maritime industry. So I am the director and head of MTCC Caribbean, one of 5 centers that was established under the auspices of the IMO as the implementer and the EU as the funding agency. As Bogdan mentioned, these 5 centers were established in Latin America, Caribbean, Pacific, and Asia. We currently have 4 centers. MTCC Caribbean is now assisting where possible in outreach to Latin America. So out of the 5 centers that were initially seeded as technology centers, we now have 4 because there were some administrative issues with the host center in Panama. These 5 centers were essentially tasked with delivering 5 results. And I'm happy to say that the MTCC Caribbean met and exceeded expectations in all 5 of these results. Our first activity, of course, was to ensure that the center was set up and we are hosted by the University of Trinidad and Tobago and physically located at the Chaguaramas campus of the University of Trinidad and Tobago. The second result, we were required to deliver 8 capacity building workshops, 9 what was called national workshops, but given the context of the Caribbean, we actually delivered those as sub-regional workshops where we clustered the region so that we can maximize the capacity building efforts. We had 2 regional workshops that brought the entire 16 Caribbean territories that we were tasked with building capacity in over the course of the project. I should say that the project started in 2016 with the IMO initially being tasked with selecting these technology centers, and these technology centers essentially won through an open tender process. And for the Caribbean region, we were selected as the host institution for developing the Maritime Technology Center. Result 3 and 4 were linked for us. Each region was required to develop pilot projects to basically determine the uptake of ship energy efficient technologies and operations within their respective regions, and also to implement a demonstration pilot project on the uptake of fuel consumption data collection in line with IMO reporting regulations. And MTCC, of course, have to ensure that all communication and visibility actions are as required by the EU and the IMO. So what have we achieved as MTCC Caribbean? In developing our project, we were specifically tasked, and I should say, I'm assuming that persons are here are aware of the project, but I probably shouldn't, because I don't see a lot of our usual stakeholders being in the audience, which is really good, you know, because sometimes we're often speaking to the same people. So it's really nice to be in a different forum. And so in terms of the project, essentially we were tasked in building capacity for the implementation, the better implementation of the International Convention on Prevention of Marine Pollution from Shipping, specifically Annex 6 that dealt with reduction of shipping emissions from ships. So in the Caribbean, maritime research, maritime education, all of that is fairly new to the region. So, you know, a lot of regions may speak about monitoring and verification and reporting, but we didn't have those systems in place. So at inception, we recognized that before we can even start about monitoring, we had to have some sort of baseline from which we can actually say that this is the emissions coming out of the Caribbean, this is the state of legal implementation in the Caribbean. And with that focus, we developed our pilot projects in such a way that we can actually get a snapshot and a picture of what was happening in the Caribbean in terms of shipping emissions. So in terms of our capacity building, we also recognized that we needed to try to get specific points within our maritime administrations to be our action players within that respective territory. And so far, we've been very successful in that we have 15 out of the 16 territories have designated focal points. We have built and sensitized the maritime, all 16 maritime administrations have participated in our capacity building workshops at varying levels. And some of them have really been very instrumental in the uptake. Others have not been so enthusiastic, but we're continuing to massage them. And getting back to my point with respect to the baselines, through the project, we were able to create the first online voluntary reporting system and database for our 16 maritime administrations on fuel consumption from ships, trading at ports in the Caribbean region, and the use of energy efficient technology in the region. We also created our first energy efficiency operational indicator baseline for the Caribbean, and our first baseline on emissions control and energy efficiency measures in maritime shipping in the Caribbean. So these were first for the region, and it really helps us now to take the next steps. So, and these are just some pictures from our various workshops that we've held throughout the region, the 2 regional, the sub-regional, and we've had over 500 participants to date. And I'm really happy this slide projected well, because for some reason it wasn't projecting well in my slide. So essentially, in terms of our stakeholder participation, 29% of our participants have typically been the maritime administrations. We have ports, we have shipping agencies, we have other governmental players coming in particular the ministries of planning and persons with responsibility for in the environmental portfolios. We've had growing participation with the private sector, 9% of NGOs and 27% with academia. So a very nice mix in terms of our workshops and participation and support for the project. Again, in terms of our stakeholder engagement, trying to keep the momentum going. I've mentioned before 15 local focal points, and I'll speak about our regional steering committee, which is quite active. We have meetings with shipping agents and our shipping owners. We have subscriptions for our newsletters, and we have an active presence in social media as well. At our workshops, again, we've also been very privileged to have some of our technology providers and service providers actively participating in our workshops and trying to bring the technology to the region. So as I mentioned before, one of our biggest challenges in the region in terms of maritime sector and the implementation of international maritime standards has been the inadequate institutional structure across the region. Maritime capacity across each of the maritime administration is severely lacking. Having said that, we were very happy that we were able to still get a portion of the time of at least one officer to be a designated focal point. And that has been very successful in us being able to communicate and being able to action some of our deliverables. So for the purposes of our outreach, as I mentioned, we divided the Caribbean region into the northern, the eastern, and the southern sub-region. And we would have had workshops targeting the specific needs and capacity building requirements of each of these regions through our workshops. Now, in terms of our engagement with the private sector, what we've also done, we created a regional steering committee. That regional steering committee essentially is a mixture of both private sector as well as representatives of the maritime administrations. And the purpose of that regional steering committee is again to raise the profile of the MTCC, to assist in our data gathering and the uptake of our data gathering efforts, to promote visibility for the project and for what we are trying to achieve within the region. Again, with respect to the MTCC and trying to progress the maritime agenda for the region, we were very privileged to be one of the, I suppose we probably fell under the observer status, because universities are not typically represented at the Senior Maritime Administrators Workshop or their high-level symposia that they would usually host in terms of all the ministers of transport in the region. So MTCC in 2019 was invited to be present, and we were also very happy that we were able to influence the resolutions coming out of that Senior Maritime Administrators Workshop and the high-level symposia. And essentially coming out of that, we had the resolution we made impact to two resolutions, essentially stating that they would support the creation of a multi-donor trust fund that was laid at MEPC 74, and commitment from all the maritime administrations to pursue the inclusion of maritime emissions reduction in their national climate change policy, and also to implement our data collection process at the earliest opportunity. We were also invited in 2020, and thankfully that took place prior to all the lockdowns with COVID. And again, we were able to influence that. But before I get into what we have achieved in terms of the phase 2 of the project now, I'd like to go into terms of some of the lessons learned in terms of this project. So we continue to struggle with visibility. We, while we take the opportunity, we still find the maritime sector generally as an issue within the industry, within CARICOM is not prominent enough. And because the maritime industry itself is not prominent enough, we find implementing maritime conventions are even that much more difficult. So we understand the need to get even more aggressive in terms of promoting the visibility of projects in the maritime industry. We have also lobbied, and we are trying to advocate to have greater integration with CARICOM, that we can raise the profile of the maritime industry within CARICOM as well. And I know our OECS territories and our OECS colleagues are lobbying very hard to raise that awareness within CARICOM and within COTED. What we've also learned is that we also need to, have adequate time allocation for engaging and truly engaging with our public and private sectors. And, that should be in terms of not just focusing on achieving our deliverables, but truly impacting and aligning regional and governmental agendas. That is something that I think we need to be spending a lot more time on. And we need to actually create a budget towards building partnerships with industry and the private sector. Because right now we take that for granted within our project, within our network, and we sort of build out of the university networks. But I think this is something that requires focused time. And we also need to dedicate time towards formalizing informal networks so that we can actually leverage opportunities for enhancing our sustainability and implementation of the project. And we've also learned that in terms of the ease of partnering, the barriers of corporate compliance sometimes presents barriers. So we also have to ensure that we get early engagement with respect to the procurement of our various partners. And that's getting into some of the micro things, but these micro things can have a significant impact into the macro project objectives, particularly in terms of our timelines. So, okay. Right, so in terms of our phase 2, the project was supposed to end, as I mentioned before, December 2019. The project, the IMO was successfully able to negotiate an extended period for the project. It's called a non-cost extension, so we don't get additional funding, but we use existing money to continue the project into this phase. So within phase 2 right now, the initial project extension was until September 2020. However, all the MTCCs have been significantly impacted by the global pandemic. And as a consequence, we are awaiting formal feedback that we expect that the project will be extended into March 2021 to allow us to actually do some face-to-face workshops and to try to progress the agenda of the MTCCs within the context of our original intention. Having said that, we have adapted, and a lot of the MTCCs are also moving towards virtual workshops, and we are also hosting a virtual workshop in August 6th and 7th for our stakeholders. And we've typically been constrained by participation because we can only fund government and academia as our participants. But now, with it being a virtual workshop, I'd be happy to extend the invitation to all of you to participate. So that will be something that I can follow up with solely after. So as I mentioned, we're looking for a possible extension into 2021 and a phase 2 post 2021. What we have been very happy with is that we use this as an opportunity to really coalesce the effort of the region in terms of climate action in the maritime sector. And we're really happy that we have this group that is dedicated towards pushing a regional maritime agenda. So in terms of 2020, I mentioned we are working towards CARICOM and progressing low carbon initiatives at the highest regional level. We're looking to expand our regional steering committee. We're continuing our discussions. And then at the Senior Maritime Administrators Workshop, the MTCC was recognized for its invaluable support for the Caribbean region. And they invited Caribbean states to pursue the inclusion of maritime emission reduction throughout their national policies, because sometimes that narrative is not included in the national action plans. And we're happy to see that the administrators, the senior maritime administrators, their commitment to this has not waned, and we're continuing to see progress in writing the narrative for addressing maritime emissions within the national agendas. And there is also a historical reason for this, because the Paris Agreement basically says that IMO and the International Civil Aviation Authority will be responsible for dealing with that. So it didn't come in as a national focus action area, but of course, because we're all coastal states in the Caribbean region, we need to address these shipping emissions because it affects our health, it affects our port communities. So overall assessment in terms of the project, our general feedback has been the project has been blessed with high quality execution of our deliverables. We've been trying to leverage the success of MTCC Caribbean for the purposes of attracting further funding to inform fiscal, legal, and policy interventions for the Caribbean. And we're confident that with our first baselines now in the maritime sector, the region is empowered now to act individually and jointly to take action in terms of human health and the well-being of our port and coastal communities. So looking ahead, what is it that we have in mind for our future? Legal and institutional capacity building will continue to be an area of focus. Undertaking research related to maritime climate action has been requested by maritime stakeholders in the region. So we continue to try to access funding to facilitate their needs. We continue to promote the uptake of energy efficiency within the energy mix and the infrastructure within the Caribbean. And we are also looking at ports. While our initial project looked primarily at the emissions from ships, we recognize that all the energy efficiencies from ships will come to naught if our ports are not energy efficient or capable of turning around vessels within quick time. So we are also starting to look at promoting just-in-time shipping as well as collaboration with ports in terms of digitization of the ports to enhance communication and cooperation within the ports as a means to reducing the emissions from the maritime sector in general. And of course, in terms of the wider mandate, we're trying to, of course, reduce emissions and to promote the uptake of green technology in general. So that's my summary of a live and kicking project that the EU has funded within the Caribbean region, and I am open for any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Vivian. I think that was a nice compliment to show, the EU's plan and approach, and then an actual project that is benefiting us in the region from, EU support. So I'll open the